Senator Harold Voss grabbed the badge right off Emily Hayes's uniform, ripped it clean off in front of every senior officer in that room, and threw it across the table like it was garbage. 3,200 meters. He laughed. Actually laughed. You expect me to believe a woman made that shot? This is a publicity stunt. A lie dressed up in medals. He pointed his finger directly in her face. You are a prop. Nothing more. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. 20 senior officers stood in that room and said absolutely nothing. That was the moment General William Carter walked through the door. And everything changed. If this story hits you, subscribe, follow it to the very end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Emily's story travels. General William Carter had a rule he lived by. And he had developed it over 35 years of military service, across 4 combat deployments, 2 wars, and more battlefield promotions than he could count on both hands. The rule was simple, and he had never once found an exception to it. You could read a soldier in the first 30 seconds. Not their rank, not their record, not what their commanding officer said about them in a quarterly review. You could read the real soldier, the one underneath the uniform, in the way they stood when nobody important was watching, in the way they handled their equipment when the cameras weren't rolling, in the small, unremarkable moments between the moments that mattered. Carter had applied this rule to privates fresh out of basic. He had applied it to colonels who thought their rank entitled them to carelessness. He had applied it to foreign dignitaries, Allied commanders, Pentagon officials, who had never once heard a shot fired in anger, but wanted to act like they had. The rule had never failed him. Until the morning of October 14th at Fort Raven Rock, Texas, when he walked directly past Staff Sergeant Emily Hayes and saw absolutely nothing at all. To be fair to himself, the morning had been a disaster from the moment it started. The quarterly weapons inventory at Fort Raven Rock was in theory a routine inspection. In practice, it was 300 soldiers crammed into an armory the size of a high school gymnasium. Every piece of equipment laid out for review, every serial number cross-referenced, every maintenance log scrutinized by men who had been awake since 4 in the morning and had collectively consumed enough black coffee to fuel a small aircraft carrier. Carter had arrived at 0630, already behind schedule because his driver had taken a wrong turn on the base, a fact that had made Captain Daniel Brooks, his aide-de-camp, visibly aged several years in real time. Sir, if we move quickly through the primary racks, we can still make the 0800 briefing with Colonel Brooks. Sir, I know how to walk fast. Brooks had wisely stopped talking after that. The armory smelled like gun oil, metal, and the particular kind of institutional anxiety that fills any room when a 4-star general enters it unannounced. Soldiers snapped to attention, NCOs straightened. Officers who had been leaning casually against equipment racks suddenly found reasons to stand upright and look purposeful. Carter walked through it like he always did, systematically, deliberately, his eyes moving across the room in the same pattern he had used since he was a young captain, left to right, close to far faces before equipment. He cataloged everything. Sergeant First Class Alvarez on the left, maintenance log open, but not actually reading it. His eyes kept drifting to his phone in his breast pocket. Mental note. 2 specialists near the far wall, arguing quietly about something, stopping abruptly when they noticed the general's trajectory. Mental note. A staff sergeant near the Barrett section with her back half turned, working steadily on what appeared to be a disassembled receiver, seemingly unbothered by the sudden surge of tension that had swept through the rest of the room. Carter's eyes passed over her. He moved on. He spent 20 minutes in the armory. He reviewed 3 maintenance logs, asked pointed questions about a discrepancy in the M249 inventory that made Lieutenant Hendricks turn an interesting shade of pale, and had a brief but pointed conversation with the armory sergeant about why 2 of the M4A1 platforms showed no cleaning records for the past 3 weeks. He was almost at the door when Brooks appeared at his elbow. Sir, Colonel Reed is asking if you want to push the 0800 briefing. No. Yes, sir. Carter was 3 steps from the exit when something stopped him. Not a sound, not a voice, not anything he could have named or explained in a formal report. Just a feeling, that specific wordless instinct that had kept him alive through 2 wars and that he had learned a very long time ago to never argue with. He turned around. His eyes went back to the Barrett section. The staff sergeant was still there, still working. The Barrett M82A150 caliber was laid out in front of her in a precise, organized field strip bolt carrier group. Here, buffer, assembly there. Upper and lower receivers separated cleanly, every component arranged with the kind of careful intentionality that spoke not of habit but of genuine respect for the weapon. She was cleaning the barrel, now her movements slow and methodical, the cleaning rod moving through with a patience that most soldiers twice her age never managed to develop. Carter walked back toward her. He was 10 feet away when he saw it. It was a small badge, black background, silver lettering pinned to her uniform just below her unit patch. The kind of badge that in a room full of equipment and noise and officers trying to look important, you would walk right past without ever noticing. Carter stopped. He read it. Then he read it again. 200 meters confirmed precision shot. He stood there for a moment that felt considerably longer than it actually was, because Carter knew numbers. He had spent 35 years working with numbers, casualty figures, and logistics tables and range estimates and bullet trajectories. He knew what numbers meant in context. He knew which numbers were impressive and which numbers were extraordinary, and which numbers existed in a category so far beyond ordinary achievement that they essentially stopped being numbers and started being something else entirely. 200 meters was not a training record. 200 meters was not a competition result. 200 meters was a distance at which most professional snipers, trained, experienced, world-class professional snipers would tell you a confirmed precision shot was theoretically possible and practically nearly impossible. At that range, you weren't just fighting the target. You were fighting gravity, wind drift, temperature gradients, the curvature of the earth, and the physical limitations of the human body under stress. The world record for a confirmed sniper kill, and Carter knew this figure precisely, was approximately 540 meters, set by a Canadian corporal in Afghanistan in 2017. And it remained one of the most debated and analyzed shots in modern military history. 200 meters was not a record, but it was the kind of number that made the air around it feel different. Soldier, she looked up. Her eyes were calm, not the forced calm of someone performing composure for a superior officer, just calm. The way a lake is calm in the early morning before the wind picks up. Something settled and genuine underneath the surface. Sir, she moved to stand. As you were. She stayed. That badge. Carter kept his voice level. Explain it. She held his gaze without flinching. Confirmed precision shot, sir, 200 meters. Authenticated by range officer and 2 independent witnesses. That's not a standard qualification badge. No, sir, it isn't. So where did it come from? The question sat in the air between them. Around them, the armory had gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the general's presence anymore. Other soldiers were listening, pretending not to listen, but listening. She said, it was awarded following a confirmed engagement, sir. A confirmed engagement. Carter repeated the words slowly, the way you repeat words when you're testing whether they're real. Not a range qualification. No, sir. So you made that shot? Yes, sir. In the field? Yes, sir. Sir. Carter looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at the Barrett laid out in front of her, then back up at her face. What's your name, soldier? Staff Sergeant Emily Hayes, sir. 75th Ranger Support Element, currently attached to Fort Raven Rock Armory Division. How long have you been attached to Armory? A brief pause. So brief most people would have missed it. Carter didn't miss it. 8 months, sir. 8 months. He said it neutrally, like a number on a page. And before that, another pause. Longer this time. Previous assignment is restricted, sir. Carter felt something shift in his chest. Not quite surprise. More like the feeling of a door you thought was locked suddenly having a handle. Restricted. Yes, sir. He looked around the room. Every face that had been pretending not to watch quickly found somewhere else to look. He turned back to her. Carry on, Sergeant. Yes, sir. He walked out of the armory with Brooks practically running to keep up with him. He got 15 feet down the corridor before he stopped. Brooks, sir. Puller file, full service record, everything. Brooks was already reaching for his tablet. Staff Sergeant Emily Hayes attached to. I know where she's attached. Pull the whole thing. Before the 0800 briefing. Yes, sir. Sir, if I may, is there something specific you're looking for? Carter started walking again. I'll know it when I see it. What Brooks found, or more accurately, what Brooks failed to find, took the better part of 3 hours and 3 escalating levels of security clearance to fully understand. Emily Hayes' service record existed. That much was clear. Name, rank, serial number, date of enlistment, current assignment. It was all there, formatted correctly, cross-referenced properly. Nothing out of place, but the middle section was gone. Not redacted, not summarized, not paraphrased into something vague but technically present. Gone. Locked behind security protocols that stopped Brooks at the first attempt, then the second, and then generated an automated flag when he tried a third time through a back channel he wasn't strictly supposed to know about. He brought this information to Carter at 10:47, setting his tablet carefully on the general's desk like a man diffusing something. Sir, Staff Sergeant Hayes's record is it's clean on the surface, but approximately 4 years of service history is inaccessible to me at my current clearance level. He paused. It's inaccessible to me at the highest clearance level I can reach through standard channels. Carter looked up from the briefing document he'd been reading without actually reading. What do you mean highest clearance level you can reach through standard channels? I mean, Brooks chose his next words carefully. There are access protocols on her file, sir, that I've only seen before on special access programs. The kind that require direct authorization from either JSOC Command or the Deputy Secretary of Defense. The room was quiet. Carter set down his briefing document. A staff sergeant. Yes, sir. A staff sergeant attached to Armory Maintenance. Yes, sir. Has a personnel file requiring JSOC level clearance to access. That appears to be the case, sir. Carter stood up from behind his desk. He moved to the window and looked out at the parade ground, where a formation of soldiers was running a PT drill in the early afternoon heat, their boots hitting the asphalt in unison, their cadence calls barely audible through the glass. I thought about the way she had looked at him in the armory. Not performing calm, actually calm, the kind of calm that comes from having been in situations where calm is the only thing standing between a good outcome and a catastrophic one. He thought about the badge, 200 meters. Find Colonel Marcus Reed, Carter said without turning around. JSOC liaison. Tell him I'd like to speak with him. Today. Sir Colonel Reed is stationed at Today Brooks. Brooks left. Colonel Marcus Reed arrived at Fort Raven Rock at 16:30 that afternoon, which, given that he had been in a classified briefing at Bragg, when he received Carter's message, was either a testament to the efficiency of military aviation or to the fact that whatever Emily Hayes represented was significant enough that the people who knew about it moved quickly when her name came up. Reed was 52, lean in the way career special operations soldiers get lean, not gym, lean, field, lean, the kind that comes from sustained physical stress over sustained periods of time. He had the kind of eyes that assessed rooms the way Carter did, and when he sat down across from the general, Carter had the immediate impression of two men who operated by the same unspoken rules meeting for the first time. You want to know about Hayes, Reed said. Not a question. I want to know why she's in my armory, Carter said. Reed was quiet for a moment. He looked down at the table, then back up at Carter. Something moved behind his eyes, not reluctance exactly. More like a man doing arithmetic on what he was allowed to say and how to say it. She's not in your armory, General, Reed said finally. She's attached to your armory. There's a difference. Is there? She requested the assignment. Carter kept his expression neutral. She requested assignment to armory maintenance. Yes, sir. Voluntarily. Yes, sir. Carter leaned back in his chair. Colonel, I've been in this army for 35 years. I have never in 35 years met a soldier with a record requiring JSOC level security clearance who voluntarily requested assignment to weapons maintenance. Reed's voice was quiet. I know how it sounds. Explain it to me. Reed exhaled slowly. Staff Sergeant Hayes was attached to Task Force Nightfall for approximately 4 years. I can't tell you what Task Force Nightfall does. I know what Task Force Nightfall does. A beat. Reed's expression didn't change. Then you know the kind of operational tempo their people sustain, the kind of weight they carry. Hayes completed her last rotation with the unit 14 months ago. She put in a transfer request. The request was approved. To Armory Maintenance. She listed it as her first choice. Carter let that sit for a second. Was she forced out of Nightfall? No, Reed said it cleanly without hesitation. She was one of their best. They didn't want to lose her. She chose to leave. Why? Reed was quiet for a moment that lasted just a beat too long. She didn't say. Not officially. He paused again. Off the record, I was told she said she needed to be somewhere quiet for a while. Carter looked at him. Somewhere quiet. Yes, sir. She chose Armory Maintenance because she needed somewhere quiet. That's what I was told. Carter thought about what he had seen in the armory that morning. The careful, methodical movements, the patience, the complete, total absence of any need to perform for the room. He thought about what Reed was carefully not saying. The badge, Carter said, the 200-meter shot. What was the context? Reed looked at him steadily. I can't brief you on the specific operation, sir. Can you tell me if it was a real engagement? Yes. And the outcome? Reed was quiet for 3 seconds. 14 personnel recovered alive. He paused. 0 casualties among the recovery team. Carter didn't say anything. One shot, Reed added, his voice dropping slightly. She made one shot from a position she'd been holding for 9 hours. 9 hours. Carter had known snipers. He had commanded snipers. He knew what 9 hours in a hide position meant, the physical demand of it. The mental discipline required, the way time expanded and contracted into something almost hallucinatory when you were waiting, completely motionless, for a moment that might or might not ever come. 9 hours, one shot, 14 lives. Why didn't she get a commendation? Carter asked. She did. It's in the restricted portion of her file. Reed said it without any particular inflection, but something in his jaw tightened slightly, just enough for Carter to notice. She asked for it to be removed from any public record. She asked to have her commendation hidden. Yes, sir. Why? Reed met his eyes. Same reason she asked for armory duty, I expect. He stood up. General Hayes isn't hiding because she's ashamed of what she did. She's hiding because she's very, very good at understanding what happens to people like her when the wrong people start paying attention. He picked up his cover from the table. She saved 14 lives because nobody knew she was there. That's not an accident. That's a philosophy. After Reed left, Carter sat in his office for a long time. He pulled up the sparse portion of Emily Hayes's file that he could access. Read through it slowly. The dry, bureaucratic language of military documentation. Current assignment. Physical fitness scores exceptional across every category. Weapons qualifications expert rating on every platform she had been tested on. Marksmanship scores that in the unlocked sections alone put her in the top fraction of a % of every soldier who had ever held a rifle in the United States Army. I thought about walking past her that morning. He thought about how easy it had been, how completely unremarkable she had seemed in a room full of people trying to look remarkable. He thought about what Reed had said. She saved 14 lives because nobody knew she was there. Carter picked up his pen, set it down, picked it up again. He had spent 35 years learning to read soldiers in 30 seconds. This morning, in 30 seconds, he had looked at one of the most dangerous and capable soldiers in the United States Army and seen a technician doing maintenance work. He wasn't sure whether that was his failure or her genius. Maybe he thought it was both. He put down his pen and called Brooks. The Department of Defense Readiness Demonstration, he said when Brooks answered. The one they have been pushing for next month. The congressional observers, the media access, the whole thing. Yes, sir, it's scheduled for the 14th. Who's running the marksmanship component? A brief pause as Brooks checked. Currently Lieutenant Colonel Dawson's team, sir. They were planning a standard long-range demonstration, 1,400 meters, possibly 1,800. I want to expand the program. Another pause. Sir. Carter looked out his window at the parade ground, where the PT formation had long since finished. The asphalt was empty now in the late afternoon heat. Quiet. I want to add a component, he said, an extended range precision demonstration. Plan for distances up to 2,000 meters initially. He paused, and have Sergeant Hayes notified that she'll be participating. The silence on the other end lasted just long enough to be significant. Sir Brooks said carefully, does Sergeant Hayes know she'll be? She will when you tell her. Yes, sir, sir. What if she declines? Carter thought about a woman who had spent 9 hours completely motionless on a mountainside so that nobody would know she was there, who had then walked away from the recognition that followed, who had requested assignment to an armory because she needed somewhere quiet. Tell her it's a direct request, Carter said, not an order, a request. He paused. And tell her I said please. Brooks, to his credit, managed not to sound surprised. Yes, sir. Carter hung up. He sat for a moment in his quiet office. Somewhere out there in a weapons bay that smelled like gun oil and metal, a soldier was reassembling a Barrett M82A1. with the patient, careful movements of someone who had all the time in the world and nowhere in particular to be. A soldier nobody had noticed this morning, a soldier he almost walked away from. I thought about the badge, 200 meters. He thought about what Reed had said. 9 hours, 1 shot, 14 lives. And he wondered quietly in a way he would not have admitted to anyone, whether in 35 years of reading soldiers, this was the first time one of them had read him right back. He reached for his coffee. It had gone cold. He drank it anyway. Because somewhere between the locked files in the silent armory and a badge he'd almost missed entirely, General William Carter had begun to understand something that would take him the rest of this story to fully accept. The most dangerous person in the room is almost never the one making the most noise, and the most remarkable soldier he had ever encountered in 35 years of service had been standing right in front of him. He had walked right past her. He would not make that mistake again. Carter picked up the badge from that conference table himself. He didn't ask permission. He didn't announce what he was doing. He simply walked across the room, reached down, picked it up between 2 fingers, and looked at it for a long moment, while Senator Harold Voss stood 3 feet away with his chest puffed out and his face still flushed with the pleasure of having made his point in front of an audience. Then Carter set the badge down very carefully, right side up, like it meant something, because it did. Senator Carter said, and his voice was the kind of quiet that made people stop breathing, "This badge was awarded by the United States Army, which means it was verified by the United States Army, which means when you throw it across a table and call it a lie, you are not calling her a liar." He paused just long enough. "You are calling me one." The room did not make a sound. Voss opened his mouth, then closed it. Something shifted in his expression, not quite shame. Men like Voss didn't do shame easily, but something adjacent to it. The recognition that he had miscalculated the room. Emily Hayes stood exactly where she had been standing when Voss ripped the badge off her chest. She hadn't moved, hadn't reached up to touch the torn place on her uniform where the stitching had given way. Her hands were at her sides and her eyes were straight ahead, and her face was so completely deliberately still that Carter, watching her in his peripheral vision, felt something tighten in his chest that he couldn't immediately name. She had been through worse than this. That was what that face meant. He recognized it now because he had seen it before on men coming back from places they couldn't talk about, carrying weight that didn't show up on any official record. That particular stillness wasn't composure. It was armor. Voss cleared his throat. "General, I simply meant to say that the claim seems extraordinary," Carter said. "Yes, it is." He picked up the badge again and walked it across the room to Emily and held it out to her. "Sergeant." She took it. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. Then she looked away and Carter turned back to the room. "I think we're done here," he said. Not loudly. He never needed to be loud. The meeting dissolved. Officers filed out. Voss left without saying another word, which was the smartest decision he had made all morning. Within 4 minutes, the room was empty except for Carter, Emily, and Captain Daniel Brooks standing near the door, with his tablet clutched to his chest like a shield. Carter looked at Emily. "Sit down, Sergeant." "Sir, Sit down." She sat. He sat across from her, and for a moment he just looked at her the way he had looked at that badge, like he was trying to read something written in a language he almost but didn't quite speak. "How long ago did it happen?" he asked. She knew immediately what he meant. 14 months ago, sir. The transfer to Armory, that was your idea." "Yes, sir." "Not a punishment, not a reassignment." "No, sir." "You chose it." "Yes, sir." Carter leaned back slightly. "I want you to tell me why." Something moved across her face, not a flinch, more like a shadow passing. "With respect, sir, that's not information that's relevant to—" "I'm not asking as your commanding officer," Carter said. "I'm asking as someone who almost walked out of a room without understanding what was standing in it." He paused. "That doesn't happen to me often. I'd like to understand why it happened today." Emily looked at him for a moment. Then she looked down at the badge in her hand, the torn edge of the backing where Voss had ripped it away. She rubbed her thumb across it once slowly and then set it on the table between them. "Because I was tired, sir," she said. Carter waited. "Not physically tired." She stopped, started again. "After the last rotation, I came back and they wanted to do a briefing, then a debrief, then another briefing, then someone from public affairs wanted to talk about messaging. And I sat in that room and I looked at all those people and I thought, she stopped again. Her jaw tightened slightly. I thought I just spent 9 hours on a mountainside making a decision that I will carry for the rest of my life. And every single person in this room is talking about how to talk about it. She looked up at him. I didn't want to talk about it. I wanted to go somewhere quiet and do something with my hands. The room was very still. Carter said, "And the armory." "Nobody bothers you in the armory, sir. The weapons need what they need. You do the work. She searched for the word. There's no performance required." Carter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The senator called you a prop." Her expression didn't change. "He's not the first person to think it, sir. He's just the first one to say it out loud in front of a general." Something about the way she said it, the complete absence of bitterness in her voice, like she was reporting a weather condition rather than describing an insult, made Carter's chest do that tightening thing again. "Does it bother you?" he asked. "What people assume?" Emily looked at him steadily. "What bothers me, sir, is when the assumption gets someone killed. What people think about me in a conference room." She shook her head slightly. "That's just noise." Carter studied her face. "You're going to have to get used to noise, Sergeant, because as of this morning, a room full of people know your name." Something shifted in her expression, not fear, not excitement, something quieter and more complicated than either. "I know, sir. The readiness demonstration, next month. Congressional observers, media access. I've already told Brooks I want you in the program." She was quiet for a moment. "Sir, I don't think—" "I know you don't. That's why I said it was a request, not an order." He watched her. "But I'm going to tell you what I told Brooks. The demonstration isn't about you. It's about what this army can do, what the next generation of soldiers coming up behind you can do." He paused. "Sometimes the best thing you can do for those people is stand up and let them see what's possible." Emily looked down at the badge on the table again. A long moment passed. "What distance?" she finally asked. "Start at 1,000. Go from there." She was quiet. Then, "And if someone asks for the full distance, then we'll deal with that when we get there." She picked the badge back up, turned it over in her fingers. "You said you almost walked out of the room this morning without understanding what was standing in it." She looked at him. "What changed your mind?" Carter almost smiled. The Barrett was laid out in 22 components, all of them perfectly aligned, all facing the same direction. Most trained armorers don't do it that way. They do it fast, efficient. He paused. "You do it like the weapon deserves it." Emily looked at him for a moment. Then something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, but the closest thing to one he'd seen from her. "My first instructor told me you treat the weapon like it's already saved your life, because one day it will." Smart instructor. He was. A beat. He didn't make it back from Kandahar. She said it simply, without decoration, the way soldiers talk about loss when they've had enough practice at it. But the lesson did. Carter stood. She stood with him immediately, the automatic response of a soldier. "Sergeant Hayes," he said, "I owe you an apology." She blinked. Just once. A small crack in the armor. "Sir, I walked past you this morning. Didn't see you." He held her gaze. "I won't make that mistake again." She stood very straight. Something moved in her eyes that was almost certainly not what it looked like, because Emily Hayes did not seem like the kind of person who let things reach their eyes easily. "Understood, sir." He nodded, walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. "The armory needs a new inventory completed by end of week," he said. "I'll make sure you have everything you need to finish it." "Yes, sir." "And Sergeant." He didn't turn around. "Get the badge restitched. Properly." He walked out. Brooks fell into step beside him immediately, tablet ready, the day's remaining schedule already queued up and waiting. But Carter held up one hand, and Brooks, who had worked for him long enough to know what that meant, stopped talking and simply walked. Carter needed 30 seconds to think. What Reed had told him the day before was still sitting heavy in the back of his mind. 9 hours, one shot, 14 lives. A commendation hidden at her own request, 4 years of service history locked behind protocols that stopped 4-star generals from reading them. He needed more. Not because he didn't trust Reed. He did. Reed was one of the best officers he knew and one of the most careful, which meant if Reed had chosen his words precisely, there was a reason for every word he'd chosen and every word he hadn't. He needed more because something didn't add up. A soldier with Emily Hayes' capabilities and didn't end up in an armory because she was tired. That was part of it. He believed her when she said it. But it wasn't all of it. People didn't bury themselves in weapons maintenance and quietly strip themselves of every marker of achievement because they needed a few months of peace and quiet. They did it because something had happened that made them need to disappear even within the structure of the institution they served. Carter stopped walking. "Brooks," he said. "Sir, Task Force Nightfall, what do you know about it?" Brooks's expression went carefully neutral in the way it always did when a question touched something he wasn't sure he was supposed to answer. "Only what's publicly unclassified, sir, which is essentially nothing. Special Operations Element Joint Service, specific activation criteria classified." He paused. "They're sometimes referred to in interagency communications as the unit that gets called when the unit that gets called has already been called." Carter absorbed that. Last known activation. "Sir, that information would be classified, I know." Carter started walking again. "Find me someone who was on Nightfall, not Hayes. Someone who rotated out before she did. Someone who knew her." Brooks was quiet for a moment. "Sir, the kind of people who rotate out of Task Force Nightfall aren't generally available for casual conversation." "I know that too." Carter glanced at him. "I'm not asking for casual conversation. I'm asking for a name." Brooks made a note on his tablet with the expression of a man writing something he was reasonably certain was going to cause him problems. "I'll see what I can do, sir." "You'll do more than that." Carter's voice wasn't unkind. "I need to understand what happened on that rotation, Brooks. Not because it changes anything about my assessment of Sergeant Hayes. I already know what she is." He paused. "I need to understand it because I have a congressional demonstration in 3 weeks, a senator who already thinks she's a prop, and a room full of media that are going to descend on her the moment she hits that range." He stopped walking again and turned to face Brooks directly. "And I need to know if there's anything about what she's been through that I need to protect her from before I put her in front of all of that." Brooks absorbed that, nodded slowly. "I understand, sir." "Good." Carter started walking. 48 hours. It took Brooks 36. The name he found was Master Sergeant David Okafor, currently assigned to Fort Campbell, recently returned from a training rotation in Germany and listed in the Task Force Nightfall roster, the one fragment of it that existed in non-classified documentation as a team leader during the same operational period covering Emily Hayes' deployment. Okafor drove to Fort Raven Rock without being asked twice. He arrived in civilian clothes, which told Carter something. The men who came to these conversations in civilian clothes were the ones who had learned to separate themselves from their work in every possible way when they stepped away from it. The ones who showed up in uniform were the ones who still needed it. I was 41, built like a man who had spent 2 decades doing things that required him to be built that way, and he had eyes like Reed, the same assessment of the room quality, the same instant catalog of exits and angles and faces. He shook Carter's hand and sat down and looked at him with an expression of complete patient attention. "You want to know about Hayes," Okafor said. Same words Reed had used, same tone. "I want to know about the last rotation," Carter said. Okafor was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands. Then he looked up. "What has she told you? That she was tired?" Okafor made a small sound. It wasn't a laugh exactly, more like the sound a person makes when someone says something that is technically true and completely insufficient at the same time. "Yeah," he said, "that sounds right. Tell me what tired means in context." Okafor was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that wasn't hesitation, it was calibration. A man deciding precisely where the line was and how close to walk to it. "You know what she did," he said, "the shot." "Yes." "You know the outcome, 14 personnel recovered. No casualties on the recovery team." "Reed told me." "Did Reed tell you how long the recovery team had been in the field before she made that shot?" Carter paused. "No." Okafor nodded slowly. 72 hours. They had been pinned in a position for 72 hours. No exfil possible. No air support. Every ground route compromised. He paused. They were going to die. Not probably, definitely. The mission had passed the point where probability was still a useful concept. Carter didn't say anything. "Hayes was inserted alone," Okafor continued. "No spotter, no support element. Command thought the risk of a 2-person insertion was too high, given the terrain and the surveillance coverage." He paused again. "She went in alone, covered 4 kilometers of contested ground. established a position, and then she waited. 9 hours. 9 hours, 4 minutes. Something in Okafor's voice made it clear the 4 minutes mattered to him. I know the exact time because I was on the radio with the team leader of the pinned unit. I talked to him every 30 minutes for 9 hours. And every 30 minutes he told me what his casualty projections were if the next 30 minutes went the same way as the last 30. He looked at Carter. By hour 8, he had stopped giving me projections. He was just saying goodbye to people. The room was very quiet, and then Okafor said, "One shot. Target neutralized." The blockade collapsed within 6 minutes. We had everybody out within the hour. He stopped, looked at his hands again. 14 people who were saying goodbye to each other went home to their families. Because one person spent 9 hours alone on a mountainside and made a decision that most people, most very good people, most very trained people couldn't have made. Carter absorbed this. "What happened after?" he asked. Okafor's jaw tightened. After. He said the word like it tasted like something. After command wanted to brief it, document it, talk about it in terms of what it meant for future operational planning. Talk about it in terms of capability validation and mission success metrics. He paused. Nobody talked about what it cost. Carter heard something in that. What did it cost? Okafor looked at him directly. "You've made hard calls, General. I know your record. You know what it costs to make a decision that ends a life even when that decision saves 14 others. You know what that sits like afterward." Carter said nothing, because Okafor was right and they both knew it. "She never talked about it," Okafor said. "Not in debrief, not after. She answered every question she was required to answer accurately and completely, and then she went very quiet." He paused. 3 weeks later, she put in the transfer request. Armory maintenance, Fort Raven Rock. He looked at Carter. "I think she needed to go somewhere where the work had a right answer, where you could put something in your hands and make it right and it stayed right, where nothing required a calculation about which life mattered more." Carter sat with that for a moment. "Is she okay?" he asked. Okafor looked at him for a beat. "Define okay. Can she do the job?" "She could do the job in her sleep and do it better than anyone else on that range." He said it without hesitation. "That's not what I'd worry about." "Then what would you worry about?" Okafor leaned forward slightly. "I'd worry about what happens when you put her in front of cameras and politicians and people who want to make her into something she didn't ask to be. She doesn't need the world to see her general. She needs the world to leave her alone long enough to—" He stopped, looked for the word, "to put herself back together." Carter was quiet for a long moment. "I thought about Voss, about the badge on the table, about the way Emily had stood there without moving, without flinching, without giving anything away." He thought about what she had said. "What bothers me is when the assumption gets someone killed. What people think about me in a conference room, that's just noise." She had already decided, he realized. Whatever Okafor was afraid of, whatever well-meaning damage the exposure of the readiness demonstration might do, Emily Hayes had already made her calculation. She hadn't agreed to participate because Carter had asked her. She had agreed because she had looked at the situation and decided that the cost was worth it. The same way she had looked at a 9-hour hide and a 200-meter shot and decided that the cost was worth it. He stood. Okafor stood with him. "Thank you, Master Sergeant," Carter said. "This conversation didn't happen." "What conversation?" Okafor said. He was already picking up his jacket. He was at the door when Carter said, "She's lucky to have someone who kept track of the 4 minutes." Okafor stopped. Something moved across his face that he shut down quickly. "We all keep track, sir. The people who were in that field keep track of every single minute of those 9 hours." He paused. "That's why we came home." He left. Carter stood alone in the room for a long time after that. He picked up his phone, put it down, picked it up again. He called Reed. "The demonstration," he said when Reed answered. "I need you there." "I'm already planning to be there, sir." "Not as an observer, as a buffer." Carter chose the next words carefully. "There are going to be people in that crowd who are going to want to use what she does on that range for things she didn't consent to it being used for. I need someone who understands the difference between operational exposure and exploitation." Reed was quiet for a moment. "You've been talking to Okafor." "You knew I would." "Yes, sir." A pause. "She knows what she's signing up for, General. Hayes is not." He stopped. Chose again. She sees clearly, she always has. That's part of what makes her what she is. I know that, Carter said. I'm not protecting her from a decision. I'm making sure the decision she made is the only thing that gets used against her. Not anything else, he paused. Not the things that aren't anyone's business. Reed understood. Carter could hear it in the slight exhale on the other end of the line. Understood, sir. I'll be there. Carter hung up. He looked out the window. The parade ground was empty in the early evening, the Texas sky going dark at the edges. Somewhere on the base, Emily Hayes was probably finishing the inventory he had given her, probably working in the particular silence she had chosen for herself, probably doing the work that had a right answer. He thought about what was coming. 3 weeks, a range, a crowd of people who had heard the number 200 meters and didn't fully understand what it meant. A senator who had already decided what she was before he'd ever met her. Cameras, questions, the machinery of public attention that ground people into symbols, whether they wanted to be symbols or not. And in the middle of all of it, one woman who had spent 9 hours alone on a mountainside made the hardest possible decision and then walked quietly away from every conversation about it. Carter thought not for the first time that Emily Hayes might be the bravest person he had ever met, not because of the shot, because of what came after. Because bravery, in the moment, in his experience, was something training could build. The body and the mind and the years of preparation could carry a person through the moment. What training couldn't build, what couldn't be taught or drilled or measured on any qualification course, was what happened when the moment was over and the silence came in and you had to live with every calculation you had made and every cost you had accepted. That kind of bravery was rarer. He had seen it in fewer people than he could count on one hand. I was looking at it now in a woman who had asked for an armory because she needed somewhere quiet, who had watched a senator throw her commendation across a table and had not moved, not flinched, not given one single inch of herself away, who had agreed quietly and without drama to stand on a range in front of the world and be exactly what she was not, because she wanted any part of what came with it, but because she had made a calculation and decided the cost was worth it. Carter picked up the phone one more time. Brooks, he said, get me the full media access list for the demonstration. Everyone who's been credentialed. Yes, sir. Is there a problem? Carter thought about Okafor's eyes when he talked about 4 minutes, about Reed's jaw tightening when he talked about a commendation buried at a soldier's own request, about Emily's thumb moving over the torn edge of a badge that a senator had thrown like trash. Not yet, he said. I want to make sure it stays that way. He put the phone down. Outside, the Texas night settled over Fort Raven Rock. 3 weeks until the demonstration. 3 weeks until the world got its first real look at Staff Sergeant Emily Hayes. Carter had spent 35 years reading soldiers. He had walked past this one without seeing her. He would spend the next 3 weeks making sure that when the rest of the world finally looked, they understood exactly what they were seeing. The demonstration was scheduled for 0900. By 0700, the range at Fort Raven Rock was already loud. Not with gunfire, with people. Congressional staffers moving in clusters, checking phones, talking over each other. Camera crews from 3 major networks setting up positions along the designated media line, arguing about angles and light. Defense contractors in expensive civilian clothes standing just close enough to the officer groups to look like they belonged. A DoD public affairs team running back and forth with laminated schedules and the expressions of people who had planned something very carefully and were already watching it come apart in small ways. Captain Brooks stood at the edge of it and looked like a man trying to hold a river with his hands. Carter arrived at 07:15 and surveyed the situation without comment. He found Brooks got a 2-minute briefing on the morning's schedule, made 3 adjustments that caused Brooks to make rapid notes and then move away quickly to execute them, and then walked the length of the range in silence. The targets were set, 1,000 meters, 1,500, 2,000. And at the far end, barely visible against the Texas morning, a target at a distance that the range officers had spent 2 days calculating and verifying. 200 meters. Nobody had asked for it to be set up. Carter had ordered it quietly 4 days before through channels that bypassed the public affairs team entirely. He had not told Brooks, he had not told Reed, though Reed arriving at 0720 in his dress uniform with the particular alertness of a man who expects something to happen, looked at the range layout, and then looked at Carter and said nothing, which meant he understood. What Carter had not done was tell Emily. He would need to think about whether that was the right call. He was still thinking about it at 07:30 when Brooks appeared at his elbow. "Sergeant Hayes is here, sir." Carter turned. She was standing 50 yards back at the edge of the staging area in her dress uniform. The badge was there, properly restitched, exactly where Voss had torn it from. She was talking to one of the range officers, nodding at something he was showing her on a clipboard, her expression professional and focused, and giving nothing away. She looked up and found Carter across the distance between them, held his gaze for a moment. He gave her a single nod. She nodded back, looked away, went back to the clipboard. Brooks said quietly, "Sir Senator Voss is in the VIP section. He arrived 20 minutes ago." Carter had known Voss would be there. The senator sat on the Armed Services Committee and had made a point of attending every DoD demonstration for the past 4 years. His presence was political, not military. He came to these events to be seen, to ask the kind of questions that sounded informed without requiring actual knowledge, and to generate the appearance of oversight without the inconvenience of genuine accountability. Carter had also, in the 3 weeks since the conference room, done something he did not often do. He had pulled every piece of publicly available information on Harold Voss. Not the classified, because he didn't need it. The public record was sufficient. Voss had been on the Armed Services Committee for 11 years. He had voted against 3 separate proposals to expand combat roles for female service members. He had publicly stated on 2 occasions that Carter could find in congressional transcripts that the integration of women into special operations units was driven by political pressure rather than operational need. He had never served, not a day, not a reserve weekend, not a summer ROTC program. Carter had read all of this and felt something specific and controlled settle into place in his chest. Not anger exactly, something colder and more useful than anger. He was ready for today. At 0855, the crowd assembled along the range. The VIP section filled with suits and uniforms. The media line buzzed with the low-frequency excitement of people who knew they were about to see something worth filming. The congressional observers took their positions with the self-conscious seriousness of people performing the act of paying attention. At 0900 exactly, Lieutenant Colonel Dawson began the formal introduction. Carter stood to one side and listened without listening, his eyes moving across the crowd the way they always did. Cataloging, reading. Voss was in the front row of the VIP section. He had his arms crossed and his chin slightly elevated in the way men do when they want to project skepticism before a thing has even started. His chief of staff leaned close and said something, and Voss shook his head slightly. Whatever it was, he wasn't interested. Carter watched him. Dawson finished the introduction. The first shooter took position. The morning proceeded. The standard demonstration was solid. Dawson's team had prepared well. 3 shooters rotating platforms, progressive distances. The crowd responded the way crowds at these events always responded, impressed at the right moments, murmuring with the particular energy of people watching competence they couldn't fully understand but could recognize. Then Dawson said, "And now representing the Army's extended range precision capability." He paused in the practiced way of a man who had been told to pause there. Staff Sergeant Emily Hayes. Emily walked to the firing line. She was carrying the Barrett. The crowd shifted, not loudly. A collective adjustment of attention, the way a room changes when someone enters it who changes the room. Carter watched Voss. The senator's arms were still crossed. His chin was still up, but something in his eyes had moved. Not recognition, not respect. Something more like the instinctive alertness of a man who has been confident about something and has just had a small, unwelcome doubt. Emily set up without ceremony. No performance. No acknowledgement of the crowd. She checked her equipment with the same methodical attention Carter had first seen in the armory 6 weeks ago on a morning when he had almost walked past her without stopping. The first target, 1,000 meters. She fired. Impact confirmed. The crowd applauded, polite, impressed, not transformed. The second target, 1,500 meters. She fired. Impact confirmed. The applause was warmer this time. The media cameras had tightened their angles. Carter could see it in the way the operators were adjusting. They had come expecting a story, and they were beginning to understand that they had one. The third target, 2,000 meters. She fired. Impact confirmed. The crowd was different now. The polite applause was gone. What replaced it was something rawer, the sound people make when they have witnessed something that their understanding of possible has not yet caught up with. A few people said things. He could hear fragments. Did she just in 2,000 meters? That's over a mile, and the woman in the Voss had uncrossed his arms. Carter noticed that. He noticed the exact moment it happened. The senator's arms came apart and dropped to his sides, and he leaned forward slightly, just a degree or two. And that tiny forward lean was the most honest thing Harold Voss had done all morning. Then Dawson stepped to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our scheduled. What about the badge? The voice came from the media line. A reporter, young, sharp-faced, press credentials around his neck, already halfway over the barrier he wasn't supposed to cross. The badge says 200 meters. That target out there is that 200 meters. The crowd went quiet in a way that had a different quality from the quiet before. This was anticipatory quiet, the kind that happens at the edge of something. Dawson looked at Carter. Carter gave him nothing. No signal, no help. Let the moment breathe. Dawson looked back at the reporter. The scheduled demonstration is General Carter. The reporter pivoted, aimed directly. The badge on Sergeant Hayes' uniform says 200 meters confirmed precision shot. Is there a target set at that distance? Every head in the crowd turned toward Carter. Every camera turned toward Carter. Voss turned toward Carter. Carter looked out at the range. Then he looked at Emily, who had stood up from the firing position and was standing with the Barrett at her side watching him. Her face was, as always, completely still. But in her eyes was a question. Not fear, not protest, just a question. He looked at her for one long moment. Then he looked at the reporter. There is a target at 200 meters, Carter said. His voice carried without effort. Whether Sergeant Hayes fires it is her decision, not mine. The reporter turned immediately. Sergeant Hayes. Emily looked at the reporter. Then she looked at the crowd. Then she looked at Voss, who was standing in the front row, with his arms at his sides and his chin no longer elevated, and something on his face that was the closest thing to uncertainty Carter had seen from him. Then she looked back at Carter. He gave her nothing. It was her call. He had meant what he said. This was not an order. It was not even a request. It was a door standing open, and what she did with it was entirely hers. The silence lasted 11 seconds. Carter counted them. On the 12th second, Emily picked up the Barrett and walked back to the firing line. The crowd made a sound that wasn't quite a cheer. Something that started as an exhale and became something more. Cameras repositioned. The media line, which had been straining at its boundary, collectively leaned forward. Emily settled into position. She took her time. She was not performing the taking of time. That was the thing that made the crowd go quiet in a way it hadn't before. She was genuinely still, genuinely present, processing something invisible, the calculus of wind and distance and physics that lived in her body now as something close to instinct. But not pure instinct. Never pure instinct. That was the part civilians couldn't understand from the outside. The stillness wasn't emptiness. It was the opposite of emptiness. It was a mind running at full capacity, accounting for every variable, eliminating every possibility of error, one at a time until what remained was certainty. 2 minutes passed. In the crowd, someone's phone buzzed, immediately silenced. 4 minutes. Carter heard Voss say something low to his chief of staff. The chief of staff shook his head. 6 minutes. A DoD public affairs staffer moved toward Dawson, and Dawson, without looking, held up one hand. Stop. The staffer stopped. 8 minutes. Emily had not moved. She was breathing. Carter knew in the control pattern that special operations snipers spent years learning to maintain. 4 counts in, hold for 4, 4 counts out, not thinking about the crowd, not thinking about the cameras, not thinking about Voss or the reporter or the badge or anything except the target at the far end of the range that most of the people behind her probably couldn't even see clearly. 9 minutes. Carter thought about what Okafor had said. 9 hours, 4 minutes. He had known the exact time because he had been on the radio for every minute of it. This was not 9 hours, but the quality of it, the weight of the silence, the sense of a person at the absolute edge of their capacity, holding everything together by the force of trained will. Carter felt it. He recognized it in his body before his mind caught up with it. She was back there. Not completely, but some part of her, some part of Emily Hayes was back on that mountainside, and the shot she was about to take was carrying more than a 750-grain bullet at a target 200 meters downrange. It was carrying everything she had decided to carry when she walked back to this firing line. On the 10th minute, she fired. The Barrett's report hit the crowd like a physical thing, a concussive sound that didn't just reach the ears, but reached the chest, the sternum, the place in the body where shock registers before the mind has processed it. Silence, 4 seconds of silence that were the longest 4 seconds Carter had experienced in recent memory. Then from the range officer at the far position, the radio crackled. Impact confirmed, center mass, 200 meters. The crowd erupted. Not polite applause, not the impressed murmur of a demonstration audience. The raw, involuntary sound of people who have witnessed something that has permanently changed their understanding of what a human being can do. Reporters shouting into cameras. Congressional staffers grabbing each other's arms. 2 officers near Carter, who had spent their careers around firearms, making sounds that were essentially just noise, because language had temporarily failed them. Carter stood in the middle of all of it and watched Emily. She stood up from the firing line. She did not raise her arms, did not turn to acknowledge the crowd, did not do anything that a person performing a moment would do. She picked up her spent casing from the ground, looked at it once, put it in her pocket. Then she began clearing and safing the Barrett with the same methodical care she had shown in the armory the first morning he had seen her. Carter felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. Not pride exactly, though it was close. Something older and quieter than pride. The feeling of having been in the presence of a thing that was genuinely, uncomplicatedly excellent. Not excellent for its context, not excellent given the circumstances, just excellent, period. He started moving through the crowd toward her. He was halfway there when he saw Voss moving too. The senator was not running. Senators did not run. But he was moving with a purpose that was different from his earlier movements. No performance in it, no audience consciousness. He was just moving toward Emily Hayes with the directness of a man who has decided something and is acting on it before he can decide not to. Carter adjusted his trajectory. He arrived at Emily's position 2 seconds before Voss did. Emily looked up from the Barrett, saw Carter, then saw Voss appearing at Carter's shoulder. Something moved across her face, not fear, not anger. Just the careful, watchful attention of someone who has learned to read rooms quickly. Voss stopped. He was silent for a moment. The crowd noise was still high around them, but there was a small circle of quiet in the immediate space between the three of them, the way important moments generate their own acoustic. Voss said, "Sergeant Hayes." "Senator," she said. He was quiet for another moment. Carter watched him, watched the internal calculation happening behind the senator's eyes. Voss was not a stupid man. He was a man who had made a very public assumption and had just watched that assumption detonate at 200 meters with center mass accuracy. "I said things," Voss said in that conference room 3 weeks ago. Emily looked at him steadily. "Yes, sir." He stopped. His jaw worked slightly. "They were not things I should have said." Carter waited. Emily said, "Was there something specific, Senator, or just the general?" "The badge," Voss said. "What I did with the badge." He met her eyes directly, and Carter could see the effort it cost him, not because Voss was incapable of looking people in the eyes, but because this specific looking was requiring him to see something he had not wanted to see. "I was wrong." Emily looked at him for a moment that stretched just long enough to be meaningful. "I know," she said, simply, no heat in it, no performance of graciousness either. Just a statement of fact from a person who had known it the whole time. Something in Voss's face shifted, the particular shift of a man who expected to be made to work harder for a forgiveness that had apparently already been decided without him. "You're not angry," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Being angry at you, Senator, would require spending energy on you that I need for other things." She looked at him directly. "With respect." Voss was quiet for a moment. Then unexpectedly, he made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Fair enough," he said. He looked at Carter, then back at Emily. "What you just did out there is what I was trained to do," Emily said. "I understand that now." He paused. "I didn't before. I should have." He looked down at the badge on her chest, the restitched one, then back up at her face. He seemed to be deciding something. "I have a committee hearing in 3 weeks. I'd like you to testify." Carter felt the air in the small circle change. Emily went very still. About women in combat roles, Voss continued. About extended range precision. About what the capability actually looks like from the inside. He paused. I've been making arguments without data. I'd like data. Carter watched Emily. She was quiet for a long moment, longer than she had been quiet in the conversation so far. He could see her working through something. Not the decision itself, he had a feeling the decision came quickly for Emily Hayes, that she had a finely calibrated sense of where her obligations lay. What she was working through was something else. She said, Senator, if I testify accurately. I would expect nothing else. That means I'll say things you won't want to hear alongside things you will. She held his gaze. I won't be adjusted to fit an argument. Mine or yours. Voss looked at her for a moment. Sergeant in 11 years on the Armed Services Committee. The testimony that has been most useful to me has always been the testimony that made me most uncomfortable. He paused. Will you think about it? I don't need to think about it, Emily said. Yes. Voss nodded. Once briefly with the economy of a man who has gotten what he came for and knows when to leave. He looked at Carter. General. Then he turned and walked back toward the VIP section. Carter and Emily stood alone in the small circle of quiet. That was unexpected, Carter said. Yes, sir. How do you feel about testifying? Emily was quiet for a moment. She looked down at the Barrett in her hands. Terrified, she said. Carter looked at her. Of all the things he had expected her to say, that was not it. Terrified, he repeated. Yes, sir. She looked up at him. I know how to make a shot at 200 meters. I've done it under conditions most people couldn't survive. I know how to hold a position and control my body and manage every variable I can manage and accept the ones I can't. She paused. I have no idea how to sit in front of a congressional committee and explain what it's like to be me. She stopped. That is legitimately terrifying. Carter felt something ease slightly in his chest. Not because she was afraid, because she was honest about it. Because there was a version of Emily Hayes he had been slightly worried about meeting the version that had processed everything so completely that nothing touched her anymore. The version that was more armor than person. This was not that version. You'll be fine, he said. She gave him a look that said she understood he meant it as more than reassurance. You'll be there. Front row, she nodded, looked back at the range. The crowd was still moving, still buzzing, cameras still rolling. 2 reporters had broken the media line completely and were heading toward them with microphones, and Carter caught the eye of a military police sergeant who moved to intercept. Sir, Emily said, yes. The 200-meter target, you had it set up before today. It wasn't a question. He didn't treat it like one. Yes. You didn't tell me? No. She was quiet for a moment. Why? Carter considered the question. Because if I'd told you it was out there, you would have had 3 weeks to think about it, to plan for it, to prepare a version of yourself for it. He looked at her. What happened out there today wasn't about preparation. It was about what you are when nobody's told you what to be. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in her face. Something that was, he thought, the closest he had seen to her real face, the one underneath the armor that Okafor and Reed and the armory and the quiet work with her hands had built up over 14 months of deliberate disappearance. That's a significant amount of trust to extend to someone you've known for 6 weeks, she said. Yes, Carter said, it is. What if I'd missed you? He looked at her steadily. You weren't going to miss. You couldn't have known that. No, he agreed, but I knew you wouldn't fire until you were certain. And I knew that if you decided you weren't certain, you'd walk away from the line and nobody in that crowd would have said a word against you for it. He paused. That's the thing about actually being good at something, Sergeant. People who are really good know when not to do it. Emily looked at him for another long moment. Then she turned back to the range, to the distant point invisible now in the Texas heat, where a target had been placed and struck, and the world had seen it happen and was now going to spend a considerable amount of time trying to understand what it meant. She said, what happens now? Now, Carter said, it gets complicated. She made a small sound, not quite a laugh. I know. She paused. I knew it would when I came back to the line. She looked at him. I just want you to know that I thought about it. Before I walked back, I thought about what Okafor would say, What Reed would say, what I would lose. She was quiet for a moment. And I thought about 14 people who went home, and I decided the cost was worth it. Carter looked at her. The same calculation, the same clear-eyed, undeceived assessment of what was being asked and what it would on and whether the math worked. The same woman who had spent 9 hours on a mountainside. I know you did, he said. She nodded, looked at the Barrett in her hands. I should clean this. You should. She turned to walk toward the staging area. He watched her go. 3 steps, and then she stopped without turning around. Sir, she said. Yes. Thank you for picking up the badge. A pause. In the conference room. He said nothing, because there was nothing sufficient to say. She walked away. The crowd was still moving around the range. The cameras were still rolling. Somewhere in the VIP section, a senator was talking to his chief of staff about a hearing that would change the conversation about women in combat. Somewhere at the media line, reporters were filing the first drafts of stories that would be read by millions of people who had never heard of Staff Sergeant Emily Hayes until today. Carter stood alone at the edge of the firing line and understood that the world Emily had been carefully absent from for 14 months had just found her address. And the only question left, the question he would spend the next week thinking about, the question that would keep him in his office past midnight more than once, was whether the world was ready for what she was going to say when it showed up at her door. He looked out at the distant point where the target stood, struck clean through at the center at a distance that 3 hours ago, most of this crowd had believed was theoretical. Some things he thought are only theoretical until they aren't. He turned and walked back through the crowd. The stories went live at 2200 that night. Carter was still in his office when Brooks sent him the first link. He clicked it, read the headline, set his phone face down on his desk, and sat for a moment with his hands flat on the surface, breathing. Then he picked the phone back up and read the rest of it. The coverage was not what he had feared. It was something more complicated than what he had feared. The footage was everywhere. 3 networks, 4 major digital outlets, 17 different social media cuts of varying length and quality. The shot itself, the 10 minutes of stillness before it, the moment the radio cracked with impact confirmed. A reporter from one of the networks had been positioned perfectly and had caught the audio cleanly, and you could hear in the background behind Emily's shot the collective intake of breath from 200 people at once, which was the kind of sound that once you heard it, you did not forget. The coverage was largely respectful, largely accurate. The numbers were right. The context was handled carefully by most outlets, with the notable exception of one political commentary site that had already turned the story into an argument about something that had nothing to do with Emily Hayes and everything to do with an ongoing culture war that was going to use her whether she consented to it or not. Carter read that piece twice. Then he called Reed. Have you seen it? He asked. All of it, Reed said. Well, the serious coverage is good. The political stuff is going to be a problem. Yes, sir. Has she seen any of it? Carter didn't know. He realized sitting in his office at 2230 that he had no idea where Emily was or whether anyone had thought to tell her that her face was currently on the front page of 3 major news websites. He put Reed on hold and called Brooks. Has anyone been in contact with Sergeant Hayes since the demonstration? A pause on Brooks's end that told Carter the answer before Brooks said it. Sir, I heard CO was briefed, but I don't believe anyone has specifically. Find out where she is now. He went back to Reed. We'll deal with the political coverage when we deal with it. Right now, I need to know she's not sitting alone somewhere, reading that material without context. Reed was quiet for a moment. She's tougher than you're giving her credit for, sir. I know exactly how tough she is, Carter said. That's not the issue. The issue is that there's a version of being tough that gets you through a 9-hour hide on a mountainside and a completely different version that gets you through watching strangers on the internet use your face to win arguments you never agreed to be part of. He paused. Those are different muscles, and one of them she hasn't had to use yet. Reed didn't argue with that. Brooks called back 4 minutes later. Sir Sergeant Hayes is in the armory. Range officers saw her badge in about an hour ago. Carter checked the time, 22:47. Of course she is, he said. He drove to the armory himself. No Brooks, no escort. He badged in at the side entrance and walked through the quiet of a building that was at this hour almost entirely empty. Almost. She was at her usual station. The Barrett was laid out in front of her, in its component pieces, each one exactly where it always was. The cleaning supplies arranged with the precision of a person who needed the work to be organized when everything else wasn't. She had her back half turned when he came in, and she didn't startle when she heard him just went still for a moment and then continued what she was doing. "Sir," she said without turning. "Sergeant." He sat down on a stool nearby, not close enough to crowd, not far enough to suggest he was keeping his distance. Just present, the way you sit with someone who doesn't need to be fixed, just not left alone. She continued working for a moment. Then she said, "You've seen the coverage." "Yes." "All of it?" "Yes." She was quiet. Her hands kept moving, the cleaning rod through the barrel slow and methodical. "The political site," she said. "The one that's using it for—" She stopped, started again. "They don't know anything about me. They don't know anything about why I made that shot or what it cost or what any of it means. And they're writing about me like I'm a—" She stopped again. "A prop," Carter said. She set down the cleaning rod, turned and looked at him. Her eyes were tired in a way they hadn't been that morning. Not defeated, just tired in the specific way that comes from having been seen by people who see only what they want to see. "Voss said that," she said, "in the conference room. And I stood there and told myself it didn't matter what he thought because I knew what was true." She paused. "This is different because there are millions of them and they're all very confident about who I am and what I represent. And I don't get to stand in the room and tell them they're wrong." Carter looked at her. "No, you don't. So what do I do?" It was the most direct thing she had asked him. Not tactical, not operational, just what do I do? The question of someone who has reached the edge of a terrain they haven't trained for. Carter said, "You remember why you went back to the line today?" She held his gaze. 14 people went home. "Right, that's the true thing. Everything else—" He paused. "Everything else is noise. And you said it yourself. You know how to work in noise." She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked back at the Barrett components on the table. "The hearing is in 3 weeks," she said. "Yes." "Voss's committee." "Yes." She picked up the cleaning rod again, held it without using it. "What if I say the wrong thing?" Carter thought about that. What would the wrong thing be? She was quiet for a moment. "There are things about that mission, about the rotation, that I haven't said out loud to anyone. Not in debrief, not after." She paused. "There are things I've been carrying for 14 months that I'm not sure I know how to put into words. And if I sit in front of that committee and someone asks the right question—" She stopped. "Or the wrong question, depending on how you look at it." "You're afraid of what comes out," Carter said. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no. She set the cleaning rod down again and looked at her hands. "I made a decision," she said, "on that mountainside, and I would make it again. I know that. I've been very clear with myself about that." She paused. "But knowing you'd make the same decision again doesn't mean the decision didn't cost you anything." Carter was quiet for a long moment. I thought about every soldier he had known who had come back from something carrying something that had no official name in any military documentation. The ones who had made the right call and lived with what the right call looked like in the dark hours of the morning. The ones who had been told they were heroes and had known that the word hero contained nothing that matched what was actually inside them. He said, "Before the hearing, I want you to talk to someone." She looked at him. He could see the automatic resistance forming. "Sir, I don't need—" "Not a therapist." He said it before she could build the wall higher. "I want you to talk to Colonel Reed about the rotation, about all of it, not for any official record, not for any debrief. Just say it out loud, once, to someone who was there." He paused. Okafor was right about something. The people who were in that field keep track of every minute. They know what it cost. They want to know, you know they know. He held her gaze. "You don't have to carry it alone just because you chose to carry it quietly." The armory was very still. Emily looked at him for a long time, long enough that Carter began to wonder if he had miscalculated, if he had pushed into a space she wasn't ready for and closed a door instead of opening one. Then she said, "Did Reed tell you to say that?" "No." "Okafor?" "No." She looked down at the Barrett parts on the table, picked up the bolt carrier group, turned it in her hands. 9 hours is a long time to be alone with a decision," she said quietly. "Yes," Carter said, "it is." She was quiet for another moment. Then she set the bolt carrier down with a careful, deliberate movement. "I'll talk to Reed," she said. Carter nodded. "Good." He stood. "Go get some sleep, Sergeant." "Yes, sir." She paused. "Sir?" "Yes." The 4 minutes. She was looking at the Barrett again, not at him. "After I fired, before the radio confirmed, those 4 seconds felt like I thought—" She stopped. "I thought I'd missed." Carter stood very still. "4 seconds," she said. "And in those 4 seconds, I thought about 14 people, and I thought I have failed them. I have been out here for 9 hours, and I have failed them." She paused, and then the radio came back. The armory was completely quiet. "I have never told anyone that," she said. Carter said, "I know." She looked up at him. "How do you know?" "Because if you had," he said, "you wouldn't still be carrying it." Something broke across her face. Just briefly. Just for a second. A crack in the armor that had been there since the conference room and the armory and every moment in between. Not tears. Emily Hayes did not cry in armories in front of generals, and Carter would not have expected her to. Just a crack. A glimpse of the person underneath all the competence, in the stillness, in the trained control. Then it was gone. The armor reassembled, quietly and efficiently, the way she reassembled everything. "Good night, sir," she said. "Good night, Sergeant." He walked out. Outside, the Texas night was warm and full of the particular sounds of a military base that never entirely sleeps. He stood for a moment and thought about 4 seconds. About what it is to be absolutely certain you have failed the people depending on you for 4 seconds, and then have that certainty taken back. And he thought about carrying that for 14 months without telling anyone. He got in his vehicle and drove back to his office and sat down and wrote 2 things. The first was a memo to Colonel Reed marked personal requesting that Reed make himself available to Sergeant Hayes before the congressional hearing. No explanation required, Reed would understand. The second was a letter, not official, not on Army letterhead, just a letter written by hand on plain paper addressed to Master Sergeant David Okafor at Fort Campbell. It said, "She told me about the 4 seconds. I thought you should know." He sealed it and put it in his out tray for the morning mail, and then sat for a while in the quiet of his office and thought about what the next 3 weeks were going to look like. They were going to be hard. He knew that. The coverage was going to intensify. The political noise was going to get louder. People were going to reach for Emily Hayes from every direction, wanting to make her into the thing that served their particular argument. Voss's hearing was going to be watched by more people than any Armed Services Committee hearing in recent memory, because a woman had made a shot at 200 meters on camera, and the country had seen it, and now everyone had an opinion about what it meant. And in the middle of all of it, a soldier who had asked for an armory because she needed somewhere quiet was going to have to stand up in a hearing room and say out loud the things she had been carrying alone for 14 months. Carter turned off his office light at 01:30 and drove home. He slept 3 hours. At 04:30, his phone rang. He was awake before the second ring. The voice on the other end was a duty officer at the Pentagon. Young, tight, controlled, in the way of someone delivering information they don't fully understand, but know is significant. "General Carter, sir, I'm calling on behalf of the Deputy Secretary. There's been a development." Carter was already out of bed. "What kind of development?" "Sir, there's been an incident overseas. I'm not authorized to give you details over this line, but the Deputy Secretary is requesting your presence at a secure briefing at 0600. A pause. "Sir, they're asking about Task Force Nightfall assets." Carter went very still. "Specifically," the duty officer continued, "they're asking about an extended range precision capability." The silence that followed lasted exactly 2 seconds. "I'll be there," Carter said. He dressed in the dark, drove to the Pentagon in the pre-dawn quiet of a city that didn't yet know what was happening. Badged through 3 security checkpoints. Found the briefing room on the E-ring where the Deputy Secretary, 2 Joint Chiefs, and 3 people Carter recognized from the intelligence community were already seated. The situation was laid out in 12 minutes of concise, devastating clarity. A hostage situation. Eastern region location classified. American personnel, 7 of them held by a group with both the will and the demonstrated capacity to follow through on their stated intentions. The timeline was aggressive. The terrain was complex. The surveillance coverage made a conventional extraction attempt a near certain catastrophe. The intelligence picture showed one viable window, one position from which the threat could be neutralized, One shot that if it landed collapsed the entire situation and made extraction possible. And one problem, the position was at approximately 300 meters from the target. Carter sat in that briefing room and felt the world reorganize itself around a number. The deputy secretary, a sharp, careful woman named Margaret Hollis, who Carter had worked with for 6 years and trusted completely, looked at him across the table. General, I'm aware of the timing. I'm aware of the hearing. I'm aware of what we're asking. Tell me the assets you have available, Carter said. Hollis looked at the intelligence officer to her left. He named 4 people, 4 extended-range precision specialists currently deployable. Carter knew all 4 of them professionally. He ran the numbers in his head, their range records, their field experience, their confirmed engagement histories. None of them had a confirmed shot above 400 meters. The room was quiet. Carter said, "Who else is on the asset list?" Hollis looked at him steadily. "You know who else is on the list?" Carter was quiet for a long moment. He thought about a woman in an armory at 2247 the previous night, turning a bolt carrier group in her hands and saying, 9 hours is a long time to be alone with a decision. He thought about 4 seconds. He thought about 14 months of carrying something alone. He thought about what Okafor had said. She sees clearly. She always has. He said, I need to speak with her first. Hollis nodded immediately, no hesitation. Of course. Alone. Of course. And I need it to be a request, Carter said. Not an order, the same way the demonstration was a request. He looked at Hollis directly. She gets to say no. And if she says no, we work with what we have. Something moved in Hollis's expression. Not exactly surprise. More like the particular look of someone who has been in rooms full of powerful people long enough that genuine decency occasionally catches her off guard. Agreed, she said. Carter drove back to Fort Raven Rock in the early morning light. He had Brooks pull Emily Hayes from the regular duty roster without explanation, just a note that the general needed to see her at 0800. She arrived at his office at exactly 0800, uniform pressed, badge in place, the armor fully assembled and operational. She came in, sat down when he told her to sit, and looked at him with the calm, watchful attention of someone who has learned to read rooms before entering them and has already understood that this room is different from the others. He told her everything, the situation, the timeline, the numbers. He didn't soften it and he didn't amplify it. He laid it out the way he would want someone to lay it out for him if the positions were reversed completely accurately without manipulation. When he finished, the room was quiet. Emily sat with it for a moment. Then she said, 7 personnel. Yes. Timeline. 72 hours, maybe less. Terrain and insertion. He slid a folder across the desk. Classified markings on the cover. She opened it, read it. He watched her face while she read. Watched her process the terrain analysis, the surveillance assessment, the insertion risk profile. Her expression didn't change. Her eyes moved steadily across the pages with the focus of someone reading something that requires understanding, not just comprehension. She closed the folder, set it back on his desk. 300 meters, she said. Yes. When data. In the folder. I read it. She looked at him. It's manageable. Carter said nothing. The insertion window, she said. 40-minute exposure on approach. That's the real problem. Not the shot. Yes, she was quiet again. He let her be quiet. He had learned over the past 6 weeks that Emily's silences were not empty. They were full of calculation and he did not interrupt them. She said, who else is on the list? He told her. Gave her the same 4 names he'd been given in the Pentagon briefing. Gave her their records honestly the same way she had given him honest information every time he'd asked for it. She listened, was quiet for a moment. They're good, she said. I know Martinez and Ewan. They're very good. Yes. But you're here, she said, so you've already run the numbers. Carter held her gaze. Yes. And the numbers said, call me. The numbers said, ask you. She looked at him steadily. The distinction registered. He saw it register. You told Hollis it had to be a request. He said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She stood up, walked to the window, stood there with her back to him for a moment. He let her. He watched her shoulders and the set of her spine and thought about what was happening behind the stillness. Not calculation this time. something older and more essential than calculation. She said without turning around, I told you last night I would make the same decision again. Yes, I meant it. I know you did. But I also told you it cost something. She turned around. Her face was the real face, the one he had glimpsed briefly in the armory when the armor cracked for just a moment. Not the performed face, the actual one. And now you're asking me to pay that cost again. Carter said, yes, I am. He paused. And if you tell me the cost is too high, I will accept that answer and I will go back to the list and I will work with what's there. And I will never hold it against you. Not in any record, not in any conversation, not in any thought I have about you for the rest of my career. She looked at him for a long moment. You mean that? She said. Every word. She turned back to the window. He waited. He was good at waiting. He had learned it from soldiers who were better at it than he was. She said, there are things I haven't processed yet. Things I told you I needed to tell Reed before the hearing. Yes. If I do this, I don't know what that does to those things. She paused. I don't know if I come back from a second rotation and the hearing is still something I can do. Carter stood up, walked to stand near her, not beside her, just near enough. Then we push the hearing, he said. Voss will understand, and if he doesn't, that's his problem. She turned and looked at him. Something shifted in her expression, not relief, not gratitude, something quieter and more complicated. The look of a person who has been treated fairly in a situation where they expected to be used. You'd push a congressional hearing for a staff sergeant. I'd push a congressional hearing for the right person, he said. Yes. A long moment. Then Emily Hayes looked out at the parade ground and said, I need a spotter this time. Carter felt something release in his chest. You'll have one. And I need the full intelligence package, not the summary, everything. Done. And I need to call Okafor. She paused, just to hear his voice before I go in. Carter had to look away for a moment. He turned toward the window and looked at the parade ground and composed his face. When he turned back, his expression was steady. I'll get you his number. She nodded. Then she said, Sir? Yes. The 4 seconds. Last time. She held his gaze. I need you to know that I know I won't miss this time. I don't need reassurance. I'm not afraid of the shot. She paused. I'm telling you because it matters to me that you know the difference between what I was last night and what I am right now. Carter looked at her. He thought about 35 years of reading soldiers. He thought about the morning in the armory when he had walked past her and seen nothing. He thought about everything that had happened since the badge, the conference room, Okafor's 4 minutes, the range, the crack in the armor at 2247 in a quiet building. I thought about what it looked like when a person decided something that was going to cost them and decided it anyway and decided it clearly with full knowledge of the case and full acceptance of it. He had seen that look before. He had seen it on the faces of the best soldiers he had ever known. I know the difference, he said. She nodded once, precise, final. The nod of a person who has made a decision and closed the door on uncertainty. When do I leave? She asked. 48 hours, Carter said. Are we so? Briefing starts at 1400 today. Yes, sir. She moved toward the door, stopped with her hand on the frame, the same posture he had held weeks ago leaving the armory after their first real conversation. Sir. Yes. If I don't, she stopped, restarted. If the extraction goes wrong, if something happens that isn't about the shot, Emily, he said her name, not her rank, her name. It was the first time he had used it and they both felt the weight of it. Come back. She looked at him. That's not a request, he said. That one's an order. Something crossed her face that was without question a smile, small and quick and completely genuine. Yes, sir, she said. She walked out. Carter stood at his window and watched the parade ground and thought about 48 hours and 300 meters, and a woman who had just made the second hardest decision of her life, with the same clear, undeceived eyes she brought to everything. He picked up his phone and called Hollis. She's in, he said. Hollis let out a breath. Good, I'll start the insertion planning. Margaret, he used her first name deliberately. She gets a spotter, full intel package, whatever she asks for. Already in motion, Hollis said. Carter, she knows what we're asking. She always knows what's being asked of her, he said. That's never been the issue. He hung up. He pulled Okafor's number from his contacts and wrote it on a piece of paper and told Brooks to get it to Sergeant Hayes before 1400. Then he sat down at his desk and did something he had not done in a very long time. He put his head in his hands and sat quietly for a moment in the middle of his quiet office and let himself feel the weight of what had just happened. Not the tactical weight, the human weight, the weight of having asked something of someone who had already given more than most people would ever be asked to give and having watched them say yes again. He sat with it for exactly 30 seconds. Then he lifted his head, straightened his jacket, and picked up the phone to begin the work of making sure that when Emily Hayes found that position and settled into that 9-hour silence and made that calculation for the second time in her life, every single thing that could be controlled had been controlled, every variable that could be managed had been managed, and the only thing left to chance was the one thing that was never really chance at all, the shot, which Carter had understood since the morning in the armory was never really the point. The point was the person behind it. She called Okafor at 1300. Carter didn't listen to the call. He didn't ask Brooks what was said. He had given her the number and 30 minutes of privacy, and that was the extent of what he could offer, and he knew it. What he did know was that she walked into the 1400 briefing with something different in her face. Not lighter exactly, but settled. The way a thing settles when it has been named out loud for the first time and found to be survivable. Whatever she and Okafor had said to each other in those 30 minutes, it had done something that 14 months of careful silence and armory work and deliberate disappearance had not quite managed to do. She sat through the full intelligence briefing without expression, asking precise questions at precise moments. The kind of questions that told the analysts in the room immediately that she had processed their data faster than they expected and was already 3 steps ahead of the summary. The insertion specialist tried to walk her through the approach terrain analysis, and she stopped him 4 minutes in and finished the paragraph herself correctly from memory, having read the document once. The room got quiet in a way rooms had been getting quiet around her for 6 weeks. Carter watched from the back. Reed was beside him, arms crossed, watching the same thing. "She's ready," Reed said low. "She's been ready," Carter said. "That's never been the question." Reed glanced at him. "What's the question?" Carter watched Emily point to a specific elevation marker on the map and asked the terrain analyst whether the wind pattern at that height had been modeled across a full diurnal cycle or only the operational window. The analyst blinked, said he would have to check. She nodded and moved on to the next data point without making him feel small about it, which Carter thought said more about her than the question itself. "The question," Carter said, "is what she brings back with her." Reed was quiet for a moment. "That's not a question you can answer in advance." "No," Carter said, "it isn't." The briefing ended at 16:30. Emily stayed 20 minutes after to go over the communications protocol with the team leader of the extraction unit, a Special Forces Master Sergeant named Kowalski, who had been on 3 previous joint operations with Task Force Nightfall personnel, and who shook her hand when he met her with the specific kind of respect that comes not from rank, but from reputation. Carter caught her at the door on her way out. "Get some sleep," he said. She almost smiled. "You said that last night." "I meant it both times, Islam." She looked at him. "Sir, if the hearing gets pushed, it gets pushed. Voss won't like it. Voss will manage." She was quiet for a moment. "I want to do it," she said. "The hearing. I want to say what I need to say. I don't want this." She gestured slightly, a small movement that encompassed the briefing room and the mission folder and the whole weight of the next 72 hours. "I don't want this to become a reason to keep being quiet." Carter looked at her. "It won't," he said. "I promise you that." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded. Once. The same decisive nod as before, the one that meant a decision had been made and the door was closed. "Good night, sir," she said. She left. She was wheels up at 0300. Carter was on the tarmac when the aircraft taxied. He had not been asked to be there, and nobody expected him to be there, and he stood in the dark at a distance that was close enough to see the aircraft and far enough to not intrude on anything. He watched the loading, watched the team run through final equipment checks, watched Emily appear in the loading door for a moment, silhouetted briefly against the interior light before she stepped in and the door closed. The aircraft moved. Carter stood on the tarmac until the lights disappeared. Then he went back to his office and did not sleep. The next 47 hours were the longest of General William Carter's career, and he had had careers worth of long hours to compare them against. He ran the base as normally as possible, attended the 0800 briefing, reviewed the logistics report he had been putting off, had a conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Dawson about the after-action documentation from the range demonstration, did all of it with the surface of his attention while the rest of him was in a time zone 8 hours away on a hillside waiting. Brooks noticed. Brooks always noticed. He said nothing, which was the right call, and kept Carter's schedule moving and his coffee present and his door protected from the things that didn't need to reach him. Reed called at 1400 on the second day. Insertion confirmed, he said. Team is in position. Hayes is in the hide. Carter exhaled a breath he had been holding, he realized, for approximately 36 hours. Complications. The approach was clean. Surveillance gap held. A pause. She settled. Carter knew what settled in Reed's vocabulary. Not comfortable, not relaxed, something more technical than either. A sniper in a hide who has found the position and assessed the variables and determined that the shot is achievable is settled in the way the machine is settled, every component aligned, every function verified, waiting for the moment to execute. Timeline, Carter said. The target moves in approximately 6 hours, maybe less depending on their pattern tonight. And the window, 30 seconds, maybe 40. After that terrain blocks the angle, 30 to 40 seconds. Carter thought about 200 meters and 10 minutes of stillness in a crowd of 200 people holding their breath. He thought about a range with controlled conditions and marked distances and a radio confirmation that came back in 4 seconds. This was not that. Keep me informed, he said. Yes, sir. The call came at 23:17, not Reed. The duty officer at the Pentagon, the same young voice from 2 mornings ago, tight and controlled and professional. General Carter, sir, we have a situation update. Carter was already on his feet. Go. The target moved early, approximately 90 minutes ahead of projected schedule. A pause. The window is open now. Kowalski's team is at the extraction point. Sergeant Hayes is a brief hesitation. She has the shot. Carter stood completely still. She has the shot, the duty officer repeated. But the target is at the edge of the angle. The window is narrowing. Kowalski is asking for authorization to give her the call, sir. He wants to know if she should take it now or wait for repositioning. Carter processed this in approximately 1 second. If she took it now, she was firing at the edge of her angle with a target that had moved from the projected position into an unknown micro-terrain pocket that may or may not affect the ballistic path. The shot was possible. Emily Hayes made impossible shots. But it was not the controlled shot they had planned. If she waited for repositioning, the window closed. The team sat exposed at the extraction point for another full cycle. The timeline compressed. The risk of compromise escalated geometrically. Tell Kowalski, Carter said, that the call is hers, not mine, not his, hers. A pause. Sir. She's the one who can see the shot, Carter said. His voice was absolutely steady. She knows what she can do and what she can't. Tell Kowalski to get off her comms and let her work. A longer pause. Carter could hear the duty officer relaying, a brief crackle of radio traffic that he couldn't quite resolve into words. Then silence. The silence lasted 4 minutes and 32 seconds. Carter knew this because he counted every one of them. On the 4-minute 30-second mark, the radio crackled. Impact confirmed, the duty officer said. Target neutralized. Extraction team is moving. Kowalski says, a pause, and in the pause, Carter heard something in the young officer's voice that cracked the professional control just slightly. Kowalski says all 7 personnel are ambulatory. They're moving. They're all moving, sir. Carter sat down. He had not realized he was going to need to sit down until he was already doing it. 7 people. He pressed his hand flat against the desk and looked at it and thought about how many people were alive right now in a location he couldn't name, moving toward an aircraft that would take them home because a woman on a hillside had looked at an imperfect angle and an unexpected timeline, and all the variables that had not gone according to plan, and had made a calculation and decided the cost was worth it. Sergeant Hayes, Carter said. Status. Extraction team reports she's a pause. A sound that the duty officer covered quickly, but not quickly enough. She's walking out, sir, under her own power. Kowalski says she's walking out. Carter closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he opened them and said, thank you, Captain. Keep me updated on the exfil timeline. Yes, sir. He sat in his office alone for a long time after that call. I thought about 14 people 14 months ago. He thought about 4 seconds that had felt like a failure until they didn't. He thought about 9 hours and 9 hours and the particular cost of being the person who the calculation always landed on. He thought about what she had said. I don't want this to become a reason to keep being quiet. He picked up his phone and sent a single message to Brooks. Get me Senator Voss. Tell him the hearing is back on, and tell him we have a witness who has something to say. Emily landed at Fort Raven Rock 31 hours after the extraction. Carter was not on the tarmac this time. He was in his office because she did not need him on the tarmac, and because the things that needed to happen when she landed needed to happen without a general standing there, making them into something they weren't. She came to him 3 hours after landing, still in her field uniform. She had not cleaned up yet, and she did not apologize for it, which was correct. She knocked on his door and came in and sat down in the chair across from his desk and looked at him with a face that he had been trying to read for 6 weeks and was now finally beginning to understand. The armor was there. It was always going to be there. But there was something different underneath it now. Not lighter, not heavier, just different. The way a person looks after they have said a thing out loud that they have been carrying in silence and discovered that the silence was not the only way. Welcome back, he said. Thank you, sir. 7 for 7. Something moved across her face. Yes, sir. He gave her a moment. She sat with it quietly. He had learned that she needed those moments and that the moments were not weakness. They were the opposite of weakness. They were the proof that she was still present, still feeling the weight of the things she did, still the person who understood the question. The shot, he said, the angle was off. 12 degrees, she said. I had to adjust the hold-off calculation in real time. How long did you have? She looked at him. Long enough. He believed her. He always believed her when she talked about the shot. That was the thing about Emily Hayes. She didn't need him to believe in her. She already knew precisely what she could do. What she needed from him was something different, something quieter and more specific. The thing she'd told him in the armory at 2247. You don't have to carry it alone just because you chose to carry it quietly. The hearing is in 9 days, he said. I pushed it by 2 weeks. Voss agreed. She nodded. I want you to see someone before then. Not because you have to, because I think you'll want to. She looked at him. Reed. And a counselor. One who has worked with special operations personnel. I have 3 names. You pick the one you want. You set the schedule. Nobody tells you what to say to them. He held her gaze. This is not a flag on your record. This is not a condition of anything. I'm suggesting it the same way I suggested you talk to Reed. He paused. Because you told me you didn't want this to be a reason to stay quiet. And I think the only way to make sure it isn't is to get some of it out before you walk into that hearing room. Emily looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in her face. Not the crack this time, something more deliberate. A person making a conscious choice to let something in rather than letting something out. Okay, she said, simply, without condition. Carter nodded, slid a folder across the desk. Go get cleaned up. Rest for 48 hours. I don't want to see your face before 0800 Friday. She picked up the folder, stood. Then she did something he had not seen her do in 6 weeks of watching her. She stopped in the middle of the room without the door as her reason for stopping. Just stood there and said, I called Okafor from the aircraft. Carter went still. On the way back, I needed to tell him something. She looked down at the folder in her hands. I told him I didn't miss. The simplicity of it hit Carter somewhere between his ribs and his sternum. Not the shot, not the mission, not the outcome. I didn't miss. The thing she had been afraid of most in the dark hours of the first mission, the 4 seconds she had carried for 14 months, she had needed Okafor to know it hadn't happened again. Carter managed his face. What did he say? Something passed across Emily's expression, warm and tired and real. He said he knew. She paused. He said he always knew I wouldn't. Carter looked at her. He thought about a man who had stayed on a radio for 9 hours and 4 minutes and kept track of every single one of them and had never stopped believing in the person on the other end of it. He thought about the letter he had sent. She told me about the 4 seconds. I thought you should know. Good, Carter said. His voice was steady. Now go get some sleep. She almost smiled again. Yes, sir. She was at the door when he said Emily. She turned. I'm glad you came back, he said. She looked at him for a moment. The real face again. Not the armor, the actual person behind 6 weeks of careful observation and 35 years of reading soldiers, and one morning in an armory when he had almost walked away. I had orders, she said. Carter nodded. You did. She left. The hearing was 18 days later in a room in the Russell Senate office building that Carter had been in dozens of times for dozens of different reasons. He sat in the front row as he had promised in his dress uniform, 4 stars on his collar, straight-backed and present, in the way that communicated without words that what was happening in this room mattered to him personally. Reed was 2 seats to his left. Okafor, who had driven from Fort Campbell the day before and had asked no one for permission and needed none, was on Carter's right. Emily walked in and sat at the witness table and poured herself a glass of water and set it precisely to her right and looked out at the committee with the same calm, watchful attention she brought to everything. Voss called the hearing to order. His voice was different from the conference room. Not chastened exactly, adjusted. A man who had made a public recalculation and was proceeding accordingly. He introduced Emily correctly. Every word accurate, her rank, her service history to the extent it was declassified, the confirmed engagement, the demonstration. He did not editorialize. He did not perform. He simply introduced her and then said, Sergeant Hayes, you have agreed to testify today about your experience in extended-range precision operations and what that experience tells us about the role of women in combat. Please begin when you are ready. She looked at the committee, then she looked down at the table for a moment. Carter watched her gather something that was not courage, she had that already, but something more specific. The willingness to say out loud in public in a room full of cameras and senators and people who would take her words apart and use them for things she never intended, the things she had spent 14 months carrying in silence. She looked up. She said, the first thing I want you to understand is that I am not here to argue whether women belong in combat. That argument was decided on a mountainside 14 months ago when 7 people were running out of time and I was the best option available. She paused. What I'm here to talk about is what happens after. The room was very quiet. She talked for 47 minutes. She talked about the shot, not the mechanics, the decision. The moment on the mountainside when she understood that the shot was possible and understood what making it would mean and understood that she would be alone with that meaning for every remaining day of her life. She talked about the 4 seconds. She said those words out loud in that room for the first time in any official capacity, and she said them without flinching and without looking away from the committee. Though Carter saw her hands flat on the table press harder against the surface for the length of the sentence, she talked about what happened after. The briefings and the debriefs and the public affairs conversations in the 14 months of careful, deliberate absence. She talked about the armory. She said, I chose it because the work had a right answer. And she said it plainly without apology or explanation beyond those words. And 3 people on the committee wrote something down at that moment, which meant they understood what she was actually saying. She talked about what support looked like and what it didn't look like. She talked about the difference between recognition and understanding, between being told you are extraordinary and being treated as though your experience is real. She said you can celebrate what we do without understanding what we carry, and those are not the same thing and they should not be confused for each other. Then she said the thing Carter had been waiting for without knowing he was waiting for it. She said, 14 months ago, my commanding officer walked past me in an armory. He almost didn't stop. And if he had kept walking, I don't know what would have happened to me. Not to the mission, not to the capability, to me. She paused. He stopped because he saw something. Not my record, he couldn't access that. Not my reputation, he didn't know it. He stopped because of the way a weapon was laid out on a table. She paused again. I'm telling you that story because the politic question you're asking, whether women belong in these roles, is the wrong question. The right question is whether the institution is built to see us when we're doing the work, when we're carrying the weight, when we're sitting in an armory at midnight trying to find a way to put ourselves back together quietly enough that nobody notices. Her voice was steady and clear and did not waver. The answer right now is sometimes. Sometimes it sees us. And sometimes it takes a general with 35 years of experience to walk past us 3 times before he finally stops. Carter felt something move in his chest that he did not try to control. Okafor to his right exhaled slowly. Reed to his left did not move. Voss looked at Emily for a long moment after she finished. Then he looked down at his notes, then back up. "Sergeant Hayes," he said, "I owe you a public apology. I made statements about your capability and your record before I understood either one." He paused. "I was wrong. This committee was wrong. And I intend to propose legislation within the month that addresses the support gap you've described." He paused again. "Thank you for your testimony." Emily looked at him. "Thank you for changing your mind, Senator," she said. Simply, without decoration, the way she said everything. The hearing concluded at 11:47. Carter found her in the hallway outside the hearing room, standing slightly apart from the cluster of staffers and media and people who wanted proximity to what had just happened. She was holding a glass of water from the witness table that she had apparently forgotten to put down, and she was looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone who has just done a very hard thing and is in the immediate aftermath of it where the weight hasn't fully redistributed yet. He walked over, stood beside her, said nothing. She said, "Was that okay?" He looked at her. "You just changed the conversation in that room for the next 20 years, he said. "Yes, it was okay." She exhaled slowly, looked down at the water glass in her hands. "I told myself I was going to be clinical. I had notes. I had data points." She paused. "I didn't use any of them." "I know. Was it too much?" "It was exactly enough." She looked at him. "The part about the armory, about you walking past." She held his gaze. "I should have told you I was going to say that." "No," Carter said. "You shouldn't have." He paused. It was true, and true things don't need permission. Something moved in her face, warm and tired and real. The same expression she'd had when she told him about calling Okafor from the aircraft. The expression of a person who has been seen not by cameras, not by a committee, not by the public record, but by someone who stopped when they could have kept walking. Okafor appeared beside them. He looked at Emily and she looked at him, and something passed between them that had no words and didn't need any. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder. She put her hand over his for a moment. Then they both let go. Reed appeared on the other side. "There's a car waiting," he said, "when you're ready." Emily nodded, looked around the hallway one more time at the cameras still rolling, at the staffers still moving at the machinery of consequence, still turning around what she had said in that room, and then looked back at Carter. "Sir," she said, "what happens now?" Carter thought about that. He thought about the legislation Voss had promised, the coverage that would follow, the conversations in rooms like the one they had just left. The soldiers coming up behind Emily Hayes who would walk into institutions slightly more built to see them because a woman had stood in front of a Senate committee and said the right question is whether the institution is built to see us. I thought about a Barrett M82A1 laid out in 22 components in an armory on an ordinary morning, each one facing the same direction, arranged with the care of someone who understood that the weapon deserved it. He thought about the morning he had almost walked away. Now he said, "You go back to the armory and you do the work." She looked at him, and this time she actually smiled. Not small and quick, real and full and completely genuine. The kind of smile that changes the whole face of the person wearing it. The kind of smile you only get from someone who has been too careful for too long and has finally found a reason to stop. "Yes, sir," she said. She turned and walked toward the car with Okafor and Reed beside her, and Carter stood in the hallway and watched her go, and understood something that he had been working toward, understanding since the morning in the armory, when 35 years of experience had looked at one of the finest soldiers he had ever encountered and seen nothing at all. The greatest failure of a military career was not the mission that went wrong or the decision made under pressure that cost more than anticipated. The greatest failure was the moment of ordinary inattention, the routine morning, the busy schedule, the room full of noise and performance, and people trying to look important when you walk past the person standing quietly in the corner, doing the work that had a right answer and kept walking. He had almost made that failure. He had stopped. And what had come from stopping the 14 people who went home the first time, the 7 people who went home the second time, the hearing that would change the conversation for the next 20 years? The soldier who had walked into a Senate hearing room and said the true thing out loud without flinching. None of it existed in a world where he kept walking. Carter straightened his jacket, picked up his cover from where he had set it on a bench. I thought about the badge. Black background, silver lettering. 200 meters. Confirmed precision shot. He thought about what it had taken to earn it, and what it had taken to carry it, and what it had taken to stand in a hearing room and explain both things to people who needed to understand them. He thought about Emily Hayes in the armory at 2247, cleaning a weapon that had already saved 14 lives, carrying 4 seconds that nobody knew about telling no one. And he thought about what changes when someone finally stops. Not everything, not immediately, not all at once, but enough. That was what General William Carter understood walking out of the Russell Senate office building on a Tuesday morning in October with the Texas sun waiting for him at the end of a flight back to Fort Raven Rock. Not that one person could change everything, but that one moment of attention, one choice to stop instead of walk past could change enough. And sometimes enough was exactly what the world needed. Staff Sergeant Emily Hayes went back to Fort Raven Rock. She went back to the armory, she did the work, and the work as it had always been was enough.